Subscribe to the channel for more stories. My name is Sarah. I'm 23 years old, and what I'm about to tell you changed everything I thought I knew about myself. I never imagined that one night of humiliation would become the turning point of my entire life. But sometimes the universe has plans we can't see coming. It was a Friday evening in downtown Chicago, and I was standing outside the Paramount Theater, clutching my worn leather purse like it was a lifeline. The invitation in my pocket felt heavier than it should have, considering it was just a piece of paper. My college roommate Emma had somehow scored tickets to this exclusive charity gala, and despite my protests about not belonging there, she dragged me along. I should have trusted my instincts from the beginning. Looking at the sea of designer gowns and tailored suits flowing through the theater entrance, I felt like a fraud in my thrift store dress. It was navy blue with tiny flowers, something I'd found for $12 at Goodwill, and I'd spent hours carefully mending a small tear near the hem. My shoes were comfortable flats, practical and scuffed from years of wear, nothing like the stilettos clicking confidently across the marble floor around me. But Emma had insisted I belonged there, that my voice mattered, that people needed to hear what I had to say. Easy for her to say when her family owned half of Michigan Avenue. She swept through life with the confidence that only comes from never having to check your bank balance before buying coffee. The theater was magnificent, all gold trim and red velvet, the kind of place that made you whisper automatically. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over clusters of Chicago's elite, their jewelry catching the glow like captured stars. I tried to blend into the background, nursing a glass of champagne I couldn't really afford to replace if I accidentally dropped it. That's when I saw her, Victoria Ashworth, daughter of the tech billionaire, surrounded by her usual circle of admirers. She was everything I wasn't: tall, blonde, draped in what looked like couture, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no. Our paths had crossed before at university events, and she'd always looked at me like I was something unpleasant. She'd stepped in. I was trying to find Emma in the crowd when Victoria's laugh cut through the ambient chatter like a knife. But what happened next would haunt me for weeks, and I still wasn't prepared for how this night would end. Victoria's voice carried across the lobby with practiced projection, the kind that comes from years of commanding attention at cocktail parties. "Oh my God, look at that dress," she said, and I felt every conversation around us pause as people turned to see what had caught her attention. My blood turned to ice when I realized she was staring directly at me. The group around her followed her gaze, and suddenly I was the center of attention in the worst possible way. My face burned as I tried to disappear into the ornate wallpaper behind me, but there was nowhere to hide. "Is that from a costume shop?" Victoria continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I mean, it's so authentically vintage, like museum-quality vintage." The laughter that followed felt like physical blows, each chuckle another nail in my coffin of humiliation. One of her friends, a redhead whose name I didn't know but whose father owned several restaurants downtown, leaned in. "Maybe she's going for that shabby chic look that's so popular on Pinterest, you know, the I just rolled out of bed aesthetic." "Shabby, definitely. Chic." Victoria tilted her head, pretending to consider it seriously. "I'm not so sure about that part." More laughter rippled through their group, and I watched as other people nearby began to notice the commotion, their eyes shifting between Victoria and me like spectators at a tennis match. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to push through the crowd, flee through those heavy theater doors, and never show my face in public again. My hands shook as I gripped my purse tighter, my palms sweating despite the air conditioning. But something kept my feet planted to that marble floor. Maybe stubbornness, maybe shock. Emma appeared at my side like a guardian angel, her face flushed with anger. "Victoria, that's enough," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. But Victoria just smiled wider, sensing weakness like a predator. "Oh, Emma darling, I wasn't being mean. I was actually curious about where she shops. I love supporting small businesses, especially the really unique ones." The emphasis she put on unique made it clear she meant anything but complimentary. The worst part wasn't even the words themselves. It was watching how quickly the crowd turned, how people who'd been chatting pleasantly moments before now looked at me with a mixture of pity and second-hand embarrassment. I could see them calculating in their heads, wondering how someone like me had ended up in their exclusive circle. But I had no idea that in less than an hour, everything would change. The humiliation I was feeling right now would seem like nothing compared to what was coming. and Victoria Ashworth would learn that appearances can be deceiving in the most unexpected ways. The theater bell chimed, signaling that we should take our seats, and I'd never been more grateful for an excuse to escape. Emma linked her arm through mine, shooting one last withering look at Victoria before guiding me toward the auditorium entrance. But the damage was already done. I could feel eyes following us, hear the whispered conversations starting up in our wake. Ignore them, Emma whispered fiercely as we found our seats in the third row. Victoria's just jealous because you have more talent in your little finger than she ever have in her entire surgically enhanced body. I tried to smile at her loyalty, but my stomach was still churning from the encounter. The theater filled around us with the rustle of expensive fabric and the clink of jewelry. I sank into the plush red velvet seat and tried to focus on the program in my hands. Anything to avoid the feeling that people were still staring. The gala was for arts education in underserved communities, something I actually cared deeply about. I'd grown up in one of those communities, where music class was the first thing cut when budgets got tight, where kids like me learned to sing in church choirs because it was the only option available. But sitting here now, surrounded by people who wrote checks to ease their consciences, I felt like the biggest hypocrite in the room. The lights dimmed and the program began with a series of speakers, each one more polished than the last. They talked about opportunity and access, about the transformative power of art, using all the right buzzwords that made the audience nod approvingly. I found myself getting lost in their words despite everything, because this cause was something I believed in with every fiber of my being. Then the executive director of the foundation took the stage, a distinguished woman in her 50s whose presence commanded immediate attention. She spoke about the evening's special surprise, something that hadn't been listed in the program, and I felt the audience lean forward with anticipation. Tonight, we're going to do something different. Instead of just talking about the power of music to change lives, we're going to experience it firsthand. We've identified someone in our audience tonight who embodies everything this foundation stands for, someone who's overcome tremendous obstacles to pursue their passion for music. My heart started beating faster, but surely she couldn't mean me. There had to be dozens of people here, with inspiring stories. People who actually looked like they belonged on a stage in front of Chicago's elite. This person has been working 3 jobs to put themselves through school while maintaining a perfect GPA in our city's most prestigious music program. They've been performing in subway stations and coffee shops, sharing their incredible gift with anyone willing to listen. The blood drained from my face as the description continued, each detail more specific than the last. Emma grabbed my hand, her eyes wide with realization. But there was still no way they could mean me. I hadn't told anyone about the subway performances, about the late nights playing for commuters just to make rent money. Would Sarah Mitchell please come to the stage? The world stopped. My name echoed through the theater like a gunshot, and suddenly 1,500 pairs of eyes were searching the audience for me. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. This couldn't be happening. There had to be some mistake. Emma was squeezing my hand so tight it hurt, her face a mixture of shock and excitement. Sarah, they're calling you. They want you on stage. But I couldn't move. My body had turned to stone, rooted to that velvet seat like I'd grown there. The spotlights swept across the audience, searching, and I knew it was only a matter of seconds before it found me. The executive director's voice came again, warm and encouraging. Don't be shy, Sarah. We know you're out there. I thought about Victoria and her cruel laughter, imagining her satisfaction at seeing me humiliated on an even grander scale. What if I got up there and froze? What if my voice cracked? What if I proved every one of her assumptions right in front of the entire city's cultural elite? But then I thought about my grandmother, who'd raised me after my parents died, who'd worked double shifts at the hospital to pay for my piano lessons. I thought about the kids in my old neighborhood who'd never get opportunities like this, who'd never even dream of setting foot in a place like the Paramount Theater. The spotlight found me, and the gentle applause that followed felt like encouragement rather than judgment. Somehow, my legs started working again. I stood up on shaking knees, my thrift store dress suddenly feeling less like a costume and more like armor. Emma gave me a little push, whispering, "Go show them what you're made of." The walk to the stage felt like miles. Each step echoed in my ears, and I was hyper-aware of every whisper, every turned head. When I reached the stage stairs, my legs nearly gave out, but somehow I climbed them, one at a time. until I was standing in the brightest light I'd ever experienced. The executive director, whose name I learned was Margaret Chen, met me at center stage with a warm smile. "Sarah, thank you for joining us. I know this is unexpected, but we've been following your story for months. Your music professor, Dr. Rodriguez, reached out to us about your talent and your dedication." Dr. Rodriguez, of course, he'd been encouraging me to audition for competitions, to put myself out there more, but I'd never imagined anything like this. Margaret continued speaking, but I could barely process her words over the roar of blood in my ears. "We'd love for you to share your gift with us tonight. I believe you have something prepared." The piano stood gleaming under the stage lights, a beautiful grand that probably cost more than I'd make in 5 years. But pianos were pianos, and music was music, and suddenly I knew exactly what I needed to do. The humiliation from earlier transformed into something else entirely: determination. I walked to the piano bench, and as I sat down, I caught sight of Victoria in the audience. Her expression had shifted from smug satisfaction to confusion, and something else I couldn't quite identify. But it didn't matter anymore what she thought. Nothing mattered except the music and the story I was about to tell. My fingers found the keys, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The theater, the audience, Victoria's mocking laughter, it all disappeared until there was nothing but me and the music. I'd chosen to play an original composition, something I'd written during my darkest days, when I'd questioned whether any of this was worth the struggle. The melody started soft and haunting, born from those nights when I'd played for empty subway platforms, when I'd wondered if anyone was listening, if any of it mattered. But as the piece progressed, it grew stronger, more defiant, like a flower pushing through concrete. Every note carried the weight of my story, every rejection letter, every second job, every time someone had looked at me like I didn't belong. I could feel the audience's attention shifting, the rustling and coughing that usually accompanies live performances gradually dying away until the theater was completely silent except for my music. This was what I lived for. These moments when music became a bridge between souls, when all the barriers of class and privilege and appearance melted away. The piece built to a crescendo that made me think of my grandmother's voice, strong and unwavering even in her hospital bed, telling me to never let anyone make me feel small. My hands moved across the keys with increasing passion, and I poured everything into those notes, all my pain, my hope, my refusal to be diminished by people who measured worth by the price of your dress. As the music swelled, I caught glimpses of faces in the audience, and what I saw there surprised me. These weren't looks of pity or condescension. People were leaning forward, captivated, some with tears in their eyes. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving, standing frozen with champagne glasses in their hands, listening. The final notes rang out in the vast space, and for a heartbeat, silence hung in the air like a held breath. Then the applause erupted, not the polite clapping I'd expected, but something thunderous and genuine. People were standing, and the sound washed over me like a wave. Margaret Chen appeared beside me, her eyes bright with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly why arts education matters. This is what happens when we nurture talent regardless of where it comes from." The applause grew even louder, and I felt tears starting to blur my vision. But the real shock came when I looked out into the audience again. Victoria was standing too, her hands moving in slow, deliberate claps, her expression completely transformed. The smug superiority was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. Her friends around her were applauding too, but they kept glancing at her uncertainly, as if waiting for her lead. Margaret leaned into the microphone again. "Sarah, before you go, would you mind sharing a few words about your journey? I think our audience would love to hear from you directly." My mouth went dry. Playing music was one thing, but speaking to 1,500 people, especially after what had happened in the lobby. But I thought about all the kids who needed to hear that dreams were possible, even when you started from nothing. I stepped up to the microphone, my voice shaking at first but growing stronger with each word. And what I said next would change, not just my life, but Victoria's too, in ways neither of us could have imagined. "Thank you," I began, my voice barely above a whisper, but the theater's acoustics carried it perfectly. I took a deep breath, thinking of my grandmother's strength, and spoke louder. "I never expected to be standing here tonight. Honestly, about an hour ago, I was ready to leave." I saw Victoria shift uncomfortably in her seat, and several heads in the audience turned toward her. But I wasn't doing this for revenge. I was doing it for every kid who'd ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. I grew up in Englewood, where music programs were cut before I even got to high school. My grandmother cleaned office buildings at night so I could take piano lessons at the community center during the day. She used to tell me that talent doesn't care about your zip code, but opportunities do. That's why foundations like this matter so much. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. I could see Margaret Chen nodding encouragingly from the side of the stage, and somehow that gave me the courage to continue. Tonight, someone made fun of my dress, I said, and I heard a few gasps from the audience. And you know what? She was right. It is from a thrift store. I bought it for $12, and I spent 2 hours sewing up a tear because it was the only dress I owned that seemed appropriate for a place like this. Victoria's face had gone pale, and she was staring down at her hands. The people around her looked uncomfortable, probably wondering if they'd been party to something they now regretted. But here's what I learned tonight. The value of art isn't measured by the cost of your clothes or the prestige of your address. It's measured by its ability to touch people's hearts, to tell stories that need telling, to build bridges between different worlds. My voice was growing stronger with each sentence, fueled by years of pent-up frustration and newfound confidence. Every time I played in those subway stations, every time someone dropped $1 in my guitar case, every time a kid stopped to listen to me practice in the park, that was art fulfilling its purpose. Not because I was wearing designer clothes or performing in fancy venues, but because music has the power to connect us all. The applause started again, but I held up my hand because I wasn't finished. There was something else I needed to say, something that had been building in my chest since the moment Victoria first opened her mouth. To anyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong, like they're not good enough, like their dreams are too big for their circumstances, I want you to know that your voice matters, your story matters. And no one, no matter how much money they have or how important they think they are, has the right to make you feel small. The standing ovation that followed was deafening. People weren't just clapping. They were cheering, whistling, and I saw more than one person wiping away tears. But the most surprising reaction came from an unexpected source. Victoria Ashworth was not only standing and applauding, but she was crying. Real tears were streaming down her perfectly made-up face, and she looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. But something else was happening, to something that would lead to a conversation neither of us saw coming. As I made my way off the stage, my legs still shaking from adrenaline, I was surrounded by people wanting to congratulate me, to shake my hand, to tell me how moved they were by my performance. Business cards were pressed into my palms, invitations extended, opportunities offered. It was overwhelming and wonderful and terrifying all at once. But through the crowd, I kept catching glimpses of Victoria. She was standing apart from her usual group now, looking lost and uncomfortable in a way I'd never seen before. Her friends seemed to be giving her space, perhaps finally understanding that they'd witnessed something significant, something that had shifted the entire dynamic of their social circle. Emma found me first, throwing her arms around me in a fierce hug. "Oh my God, Sarah, that was incredible. Did you see their faces? Did you see her face?" She was practically vibrating with excitement. But I found myself feeling oddly empty now that the performance was over. Margaret Chen approached with several board members in tow, all of them eager to discuss opportunities, scholarships, potential collaborations. "Sarah, we need to talk seriously about your future. This foundation exists to support talent like yours, and I think we can do much more than just tonight's performance." As the crowd around me continued to grow, I noticed Victoria making her way toward us, her steps hesitant but determined. My instinct was to flee, to avoid another confrontation, but something in her expression made me stay. This wasn't the same person who'd mocked my dress an hour ago. This was someone who looked genuinely shaken, transformed even. She waited until there was a brief lull in the conversations around me before approaching. "Sarah," she said quietly, her voice completely different from the confident tone she'd used earlier. "Could I speak with you for a moment? Privately?" Emma immediately stepped closer, protective, but I found myself nodding. "It's okay," I told Emma. "I'll be right back." Victoria led me to a quiet corner of the lobby, away from the crowds and the congratulations. For a long moment, we just stood there, the silence stretching between us. She looked like she was struggling to find words, her usual composure completely shattered. "I need to apologize," she finally said, and her voice was thick with emotion. "What I did earlier, What I said about your dress, about you, it was cruel and stupid and completely inexcusable. I waited, sensing there was more coming. Victoria took a shaky breath and continued. The truth is, I was jealous. Not of your clothes, obviously, but of something I saw in you that I've never had. You have this authenticity, this passion, this purpose that I've been pretending to have my entire life. When I saw you tonight, saw how uncomfortable you looked in this world that I've taken for granted, I lashed out because it reminded me of how empty my own life feels. This wasn't what I'd expected at all. Victoria Ashworth, admitting vulnerability, revealing insecurity. It felt like watching a mask slip away to reveal a completely different person underneath. I've been performing my whole life too, she continued, but not the kind of performance you did tonight. I've been performing being happy, being fulfilled, being the perfect daughter of a tech billionaire. But listening to your music, hearing you speak about your journey, I realized I don't even know who I am underneath all of this. She gestured at her designer dress, her jewelry, the whole elaborate costume of wealth and privilege. The confession hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure how to cross. Victoria looked more vulnerable than I'd ever imagined possible. Her perfect facade cracked wide open. For the first time, I saw her not as my tormentor, but as another young woman struggling with her own demons. You don't have to forgive me, she continued, her voice barely audible over the chatter from the reception area. I know I don't deserve it, but I needed you to know that what happened tonight, what you did up there, it changed something in me. I've never heard music like that before, never seen someone be so completely, fearlessly themselves. I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or insincerity, but all I saw was raw emotion. Victoria, I said slowly, why are you telling me this? She laughed, but it wasn't her usual polished sound. It was broken, almost bitter. Because I'm 22 years old and I have no idea what I'm passionate about. I've never had to work for anything, never had to fight for a dream, never even had a real dream worth fighting for. My biggest worry has been whether my outfit was appropriate for whatever charity function I was attending. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Here I was, in my $12 dress, having just received multiple scholarship offers and networking opportunities that could change my life, while she stood in thousands of dollars worth of couture feeling empty and purposeless. I watch you perform, she continued, and I see what it looks like when someone finds their calling. I see what passion actually looks like, what it means to have something worth sacrificing for. I've never felt that way about anything. Before I could respond, Emma appeared beside us, her expression wary. Sarah, Margaret Chen is looking for you. There are some people she wants you to meet. She glanced suspiciously at Victoria, clearly unsure whether to interrupt or protect me from further drama. It's okay, I told Emma, then turned back to Victoria. What you did tonight hurt me, not just the words, but the public humiliation, the way you made me feel like I didn't deserve to be here. Victoria nodded, tears starting to flow again. I know, I'm so sorry, but I also think, I continued, surprising myself, that everyone deserves a chance to figure out who they really are. Maybe this is your wake-up call. She looked at me with something approaching hope. Do you think it's too late to find something I actually care about? Something that makes me feel the way music makes you feel? I thought about my grandmother, about second chances and redemption, about the power of art to transform lives in unexpected ways. It's never too late to start being authentic, but it's going to require giving up some of the safety that comes with just playing a role. Margaret Chen appeared at my elbow, having finally tracked me down. Sarah, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there are some scholarship committee members who'd love to speak with you before they leave. As I prepared to rejoin the reception, Victoria caught my arm gently. Would you maybe be willing to talk again sometime? I know I have no right to ask, but I think I need to learn how to be real. And you seem to have figured that out. Looking at her tear-stained face, her designer dress wrinkled from emotional turmoil, I saw something I'd never expected to see in Victoria Ashworth, genuine humanity. Asterisk, 3 weeks later, I was sitting in a coffee shop near campus, still processing everything that had happened since the gala. My phone had been ringing constantly with opportunities, symphony auditions, recording studio sessions, scholarship interviews. The $12 dress had been retired to my closet with something approaching reverence, a reminder of the night that changed everything. I was reviewing sheet music for an upcoming audition when Victoria walked in, looking nothing like the polished socialite I'd known. Her hair was in a simple ponytail. She wore jeans and a sweater, and she looked nervous in a way that was oddly endearing. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she said, sliding into the chair across from me. "I wasn't sure you'd say yes." In the weeks since the gala, she'd sent me a few tentative text messages, nothing pushy, just small apologies and updates on what she called her journey toward becoming a real person. I'd been surprised to find myself curious about her progress. "So," I said, gesturing to her casual outfit, "this is new." She laughed, and it sounded more genuine than any sound I'd ever heard from her before. "I'm trying to figure out who I am when I'm not performing being Victoria Ashworth, billionaire's daughter. It's terrifying, honestly." "What have you discovered so far?" "Well, I found out that I actually hate champagne. I've been pretending to enjoy it at parties for years because it seemed sophisticated, and I've never been to a thrift store in my life, so I went to one last week. It was like exploring an alien planet. Despite everything, I found myself smiling. And what did you think? I bought this sweater for $8, and I've worn it more in the past week than I've worn some of my designer pieces ever." She looked down at the simple gray sweater with something approaching wonder. "There's something liberating about wearing something because you actually like it, not because it sends the right social signal." I could see she was serious about making changes, but I was still cautious. "Victoria, what do you want from me? From this friendship, or whatever this is?" She was quiet for a long moment, stirring her coffee absently. "I want to learn how to be brave like you were that night. How to be authentic, even when it's scary, even when people might judge you for it. I want to find something I'm passionate about, something that makes me feel alive the way music makes you feel. Have you thought about what that might be?" "Actually, yes." Her face lit up in a way I'd never seen before. "After the gala, I started volunteering at a community center in Pilsen, helping kids with homework. It was supposed to be just for community service hours, something to put on applications, but something unexpected happened." She pulled out her phone and showed me pictures kids at desks, Victoria kneeling beside them, both of them smiling genuinely. "These kids, they don't care that my father is rich or that I usually wear designer clothes. They just care that I show up, that I listen to them, that I help them figure out their math problems or read with them." I could see the transformation in her face as she talked about the work. This was what passion looked like, the way her whole demeanor changed, how her voice became animated and purposeful. "I'm thinking about changing my major," she continued, "from business administration to education. My father is not thrilled, but for the first time in my life, I don't care what he thinks I should do." The transformation was remarkable to witness. Over the following months, Victoria and I developed an unlikely friendship built on honesty and mutual respect. She'd text me updates from her volunteer work, photos of kids she was tutoring, stories about small victories and breakthrough moments. In return, I shared the ups and downs of my music career, the rejections and acceptances, the constant struggle to balance art with survival. One afternoon, she called me, more excited than I'd ever heard her. "Sarah, you're not going to believe this. Remember Maria, the 8-year-old I've been working with on reading? She just finished her first chapter book, and she wants to be a teacher now because she says I made learning fun." The joy in her voice was infectious. "That's incredible, Victoria. You should be proud." "I am," she said, and I could hear the wonder in her voice. "I'm actually proud of something I did, not something I bought or inherited or had done for me." "Is this what you felt like when you first realized music was your calling?" "Something like that," I said, remembering my own early moments of recognition. When I first understood that music wasn't just something I enjoyed but something essential to who I was. Our friendship deepened through these shared revelations about purpose and authenticity. Victoria had enrolled in education courses, changed her major despite her father's initial objections, and thrown herself into learning about child development and pedagogy with the same intensity she'd once devoted to social climbing. Meanwhile, my own career was blossoming in ways I'd never dared to imagine. The connections I'd made at the gala had led to a recording contract with an independent label, and my story had somehow captured public imagination. Local news stations had picked up the story of the thrift store pianist, and while the attention was sometimes overwhelming, it was also opening doors I'd never expected to see. But the most significant change was internal. That night at the Paramount had taught me something crucial about the relationship between vulnerability and strength. Standing on that stage, speaking my truth despite my fear, had shown me that authenticity wasn't just about being yourself. It was about being brave enough to let others see who you really were. But Victoria understood this now too. She'd started a blog about her journey from privilege to purpose, writing with startling honesty about the emptiness of her former life and the fulfillment she was finding in education. The blog had gained a following among other young people, questioning their paths, and she'd received messages from kids who felt inspired to pursue teaching because of her story. "I never thought I'd say this," she told me one evening as we walked through Millennium Park after one of my performances, "but I'm grateful for that night at the gala. Not for how I behaved, I'll always regret that, but for what it led to. You changed my life by refusing to let me make you feel small." I considered this as we walked past the bean, its reflective surface showing us distorted versions of ourselves. Maybe we changed each other's lives. You gave me something to push against, a reason to find my voice. And I gave you a mirror too. See yourself clearly. Is that how you see it? That we needed each other to become who we were meant to be. I thought about the interconnectedness of that night, how every element had been necessary for the transformation that followed. Maybe that's how the best stories work. Not with heroes and villains, but with people who challenge each other to grow. A year later, I was back at the Paramount Theater, but this time as a featured performer rather than an unexpected guest. The foundation had asked me to return for their annual gala, and the irony wasn't lost on me that I was now the kind of success story they held up as an example of their mission in action. But I wasn't alone this time. Victoria sat in the front row, wearing a simple black dress she'd bought at a department store, her hair pulled back in a practical bun that suited her new role as a student teacher. Next to her sat Maria, the 8-year-old she'd mentioned, now 9, and reading at a level far above her grade, along with several other kids from the community center where Victoria volunteered. The children were mesmerized by the theater, their eyes wide as they took in the gold leaf and crystal chandelier. Victoria had used her trust fund money, not for designer clothes or luxury vacations, but to bring underprivileged kids to cultural events they'd never otherwise access. It was her way of paying forward the lesson I'd taught her about the democratizing power of art. As I prepared to take the stage, I thought about how different this moment felt from that terrifying night a year ago. The fear was still there. The fear was always there when you put yourself on display, but it was accompanied now by confidence, earned through experience and struggle. My performance that night was dedicated to second chances and unexpected friendships. I played the same original composition from the year before, but it sounded different now, layered with new experiences and deeper understanding. The audience reception was warm and enthusiastic. But what mattered most to me were the faces in the front row, especially Maria's, as she experienced live classical music for the first time. After the performance, during the reception, Victoria and I stood together watching the kids from the community center navigate the elegant surroundings with wide-eyed wonder. They were asking questions, trying the fancy hors d'oeuvres, and treating the whole experience like the adventure it was. "Look at them," Victoria said softly. "A year ago, I would have been wondering if they belonged here, if they were dressed appropriately, if they understood the social rules. Now, I'm just happy they're getting to experience something beautiful." Margaret Chen approached us, her face beaming with satisfaction. "Sarah, Victoria, I have to tell you both how proud I am of what you've accomplished this year. Sarah, your music has touched thousands of people, and Victoria, your work in education is exactly the kind of ripple effect we hope to create." She paused, looking between us with obvious affection. "You know, when I called Sarah to the stage that night, I had no idea it would lead to this friendship, to Victoria's transformation, to this beautiful example of how art can change lives in unexpected ways." Victoria laughed. "I certainly never expected to find my life's purpose through being publicly humiliated for my bad behavior. Sometimes," I said, "we need to be broken open before we can grow into who we're supposed to be." As the evening wound down and Victoria prepared to take the kids back to their neighborhood, Maria tugged on my dress, the expensive one I'd bought for this year's gala, but still far from designer level. "Miss Sarah," she said, "Miss Victoria says you used to be scared to perform, but you did it anyway. Is that true?" I knelt down to her level, thinking about how to explain courage to a night. "Being scared doesn't mean you can't do something, Maria. It just means it's important enough to feel nervous about. The bravest thing you can do is try anyway." She nodded solemnly, processing this wisdom with the seriousness that children bring to life lessons. "I want to be brave like you when I grow up." "You already are brave," I told her. "Coming here tonight, asking questions, trying new things, that's all courage. As Victoria gathered the children to leave, she squeezed my hand. Thank you, she said simply, for everything. For showing me what real strength looks like, for giving me a second chance, for helping me find my purpose. Thank you for being willing to change, I replied. Not everyone would have had the courage to look in the mirror that honestly. Watching them leave, Victoria shepherding her group of excited kids toward the exit, I felt a deep sense of completion. The circle that had begun with humiliation and pain had closed with friendship and purpose. 5 years have passed since that transformative night at the Paramount Theater, and as I sit here writing this story, I'm amazed by how completely our lives have changed. I'm now a professional musician with 3 albums released, and I still perform in subway stations, sometimes not because I have to anymore, but because I want to remember where I came from and stay connected to the people who believed in me when I had nothing. Victoria graduated with honors from her education program and now teaches 3rd grade at an inner-city school. She's known among her colleagues for her innovative teaching methods and her ability to connect with kids from difficult backgrounds. Maria, now 14, still visits her regularly and wants to be a teacher herself someday, continuing the cycle of inspiration and mentorship. The foundation where it all began has created a scholarship program in both our names, supporting young artists from underprivileged backgrounds and funding arts education initiatives in schools that can't afford them. Every year, they host the same gala, and every year, Victoria and I attend together, no longer as the bitter enemies we once were, but as living proof that people can change, grow, and find redemption through authentic connection. I think about that night often, about the person I was when I walked into that theater clutching my worn purse and trying to disappear into the wallpaper. I was so focused on not belonging, on all the ways I was different from everyone else in that room, that I almost missed the opportunity that would change everything. The truth is, we all wear different versions of thrift store dresses. Metaphorically speaking, we all have parts of ourselves we're ashamed of, aspects of our backgrounds or circumstances that make us feel like we don't belong in certain spaces. But what I learned that night is that authenticity is the great equalizer. When you're willing to be genuinely yourself, to share your truth, regardless of how it might be received, you give others permission to do the same. Victoria's cruelty that night came from her own pain, her own sense of not belonging despite all her advantages. She was performing a role just as much as I was, and neither of us was being authentic until we were forced to confront who we really were beneath the surface. The most beautiful part of this story isn't the career success, or the recognition, or even the friendship that grew from conflict. It's the reminder that our lowest moments can become our greatest opportunities for growth if we're brave enough to face them honestly. Sometimes, I wonder what would have happened if I'd run from that theater, if I'd let Victoria's mockery drive me away. Instead of finding the courage to take the stage, I probably would have spent years believing her assessment of me, letting her cruelty define my sense of self-worth. Instead, I learned that the opinions of people who don't know your story, who haven't walked your path, who haven't felt your struggles, are just noise. What matters is showing up as yourself, completely and unapologetically, and trusting that your authentic voice has value. To anyone reading this who's ever been made to feel small, who's ever been mocked for their clothes or their background, or their dreams, I want you to know this: your story matters. Your voice deserves to be heard, and there's a stage waiting for you somewhere, even if you can't see it yet. The girl in the $12 dress had no idea she was about to change 2 lives that night. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be diminished by someone else's limitations. Sometimes courage looks like walking onto a stage when you're terrified. And sometimes, the people who hurt us the most are the ones who end up teaching us the most about grace, forgiveness, and the transformative power of second chances. That night at the Paramount Theater taught me that we're all just people trying to figure out how to be human, how to find meaning, how to connect with each other across the vast differences in our experiences. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, our moments of greatest vulnerability become our greatest strengths, and our deepest wounds become the source of our most beautiful music. But the story doesn't end there. Last month, something happened that brought everything full circle in a way I never could have anticipated. I was performing at Carnegie Hall, my first solo concert at one of the world's most prestigious venues, when I spotted a familiar face in the audience. Not Victoria this time, but someone I hadn't seen since that fateful night 7 years ago. It was Emma, my college roommate, who had dragged me to that charity gala in the first place. After the concert, she found me backstage, tears streaming down her face. "Sarah, I had no idea," she said, pulling me into a fierce hug. "When I convinced you to come that night, I thought I was just getting you out of your dorm room. I never imagined it would lead to all this." We spent hours catching up, and she told me something that made my heart race. She'd kept in touch with some people from that night, including Margaret Chen, and there was something I needed to know. The foundation hadn't just randomly selected me to perform that evening. Emma had been working behind the scenes for months, submitting recordings of my subway performances, writing letters about my talent and dedication. "You thought it was Dr. Rodriguez who recommended you," Emma said, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "But it was actually me. I recorded you playing in the subway station near campus and sent it to Margaret along with your entire story. I knew you'd never put yourself forward, so I did it for you." The revelation hit me like a lightning bolt. All these years, I'd believed that my breakthrough had come from my music professor's recommendation, that it was purely about my talent being recognized by the academic establishment, but it had actually come from the love and belief of a friend who saw my potential when I couldn't see it myself. "Emma, why didn't you tell me?" I asked, overwhelmed by this new understanding of how my journey had really begun. "Because you needed to believe you earned it on your own merit, which you did. I just opened the door, you walked through it with your own courage and talent." She paused, studying my face. "Are you angry that I manipulated the situation?" I thought about how different my life might have been if Emma hadn't taken that initiative, if she hadn't believed in me enough to take action when I was too scared to advocate for myself. "No," I said finally. "I'm grateful. Sometimes we need people who love us to see possibilities we can't see ourselves." That conversation with Emma made me realize something profound about the interconnectedness of our stories. Every person who had played a role in my journey, from my grandmother's sacrifices to Victoria's cruelty to Emma's secret advocacy, had been necessary for me to become who I was meant to be. But there was another revelation coming, one that would reshape my understanding of that night even further. Emma hesitated before telling me the next part, as if she wasn't sure I was ready to hear it. "Sarah, there's something else you should know about Victoria's behavior that night." I found out later that she'd just gotten some devastating news earlier that day. Her father had been arrested for financial fraud, and the family was facing bankruptcy. She was probably going to lose everything she'd ever known. The news about Victoria's family situation that night hit me like a physical blow. All these years, I'd understood her transformation, forgiven her cruelty, even become her friend. But I'd never known the full context of why she'd lashed out so viciously in the first place. She'd been facing the collapse of her entire world when she encountered me in my thrift store dress, representing everything she was about to lose. "She never told me," I said to Emma, my voice barely a whisper. In all our conversations about authenticity and finding herself, she never mentioned that her whole life was falling apart that night. Emma nodded sympathetically. "I think she was too ashamed. From what I heard, the arrest didn't make the papers for another week, so nobody at the gala knew yet. She was probably sitting there, knowing that by the time the next charity event rolled around, she wouldn't be invited because her family would be social pariahs." I thought about Victoria's transformation in a completely new light. Her journey toward authenticity hadn't just been about finding purpose, it had been about survival. When her father's empire collapsed and the family fortune disappeared, she'd had to learn how to be someone other than the billionaire's daughter, because that identity was no longer available to her. The irony was staggering. While I'd been feeling intimidated by her wealth and privilege, she'd been hours away from losing it all. My thrift store dress had represented poverty to her, but it had also represented a kind of freedom she'd never experienced, the freedom to be judged on your own merits rather than your family's bank account. I called Victoria that night, needing to process this revelation with her directly. She was grading papers at her kitchen table in the modest apartment she shared with 2 roommates. A life that would have been unimaginable to the person she'd been 7 years ago. "Emma told me about your father's arrest," I said without preamble, "about what was happening with your family that night at the gala." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Victoria finally spoke, her voice was thick with old shame. "I wondered when you'd find out. I'm surprised it took this long, honestly. Why didn't you ever tell me? We've talked about everything else, shared so much about our journeys, but you never mentioned that your whole world was collapsing that night." Victoria sighed deeply. Because I was ashamed, Sarah, not just of my father's crimes, but of how I handled the stress. I took out my fear and panic on you, someone who'd done nothing wrong, someone who was actually living the authentic life I was about to be forced into. It was the most cowardly thing I've ever done. You were scared, I said, understanding flooding through me. You were about to lose everything that defined you, and then you saw me, comfortable in my own skin, despite having so little, and it triggered something. It triggered everything, she admitted. All my insecurities about who I was without the money, all my fear about whether anyone would still care about me when I couldn't buy my way into social circles anymore. You represented the life I was terrified of living, but you seemed so confident, so sure of yourself. I laughed, surprising both of us. Victoria, I was anything but confident that night. I was terrified, convinced I didn't belong, ready to run at the first sign of trouble. But you didn't run. Even after I humiliated you, you got up on that stage and showed everyone who you really were. That's what courage looks like, Sarah. I was so busy performing strengths that I'd forgotten what real strengths actually was. Our conversation that night opened up new depths in our friendship that I hadn't known were possible. Victoria told me things she'd never shared with anyone about the fear of losing her identity along with her family's fortune, about the relief she'd felt when the arrest finally became public because she could stop pretending everything was fine. You know what the strangest part was? She said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. When we lost everything, when I had to get a job, for the first time in my life, when I had to shop at thrift stores and live on a budget, I discovered that I was happier than I'd ever been. All that privilege had been a prison I hadn't even recognized. I understood what she meant in a way I'd never expected to. Success had brought its own challenges, its own pressures to maintain an image and live up to expectations. Sometimes I missed the simplicity of those early days when music was just something I did for love, not something that had to pay bills and support a career. Do you ever wonder, I asked, what would have happened if your father hadn't been arrested, if you'd still been rich that night and for years afterward? All the time, she said immediately. I probably would have married someone appropriate, spent my life organizing charity events and never questioning whether I was actually contributing anything meaningful to the world. I might never have discovered that I love teaching, that working with kids gives me more satisfaction than any luxury purchase ever did. So, in a twisted way, your father's downfall saved you. It freed me, she corrected, from expectations, from a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt empty. On the inside, I got to discover who Victoria actually was when she wasn't performing being someone else's idea of success. The parallel between our journeys became even clearer with this new information. We'd both been forced onto that stage at the Paramount Theater in different ways, she by the collapse of her old life, me by unexpected opportunity. Neither of us had felt ready, but both of us had found our authentic voices in that moment of vulnerability. 3 days later, Victoria called me with an idea that would bring our story full circle in the most beautiful way possible. Sarah, I know this might sound crazy, but I've been thinking about our conversation, about how Emma orchestrated your breakthrough without you knowing. I want to do something similar, but this time, we do it together. What do you have in mind? There's a girl in my class, Destiny. She's incredibly talented musically, but her family can't afford lessons. She hums constantly, makes up songs during recess, has this natural ability that reminds me of how Emma described your early performances. I want to help her the way Emma helped you, but I want to do it the right way. Victoria's plan was ambitious, but beautiful. She wanted to organize a talent showcase at her school. Not just for Destiny, but for all the kids who had artistic abilities that weren't being nurtured due to lack of resources. She'd use her connections from her former life, people who still respected her despite her family's fall from grace, to bring in industry professionals who could offer guidance and opportunities. I want you to be the headliner, she said. Come, perform for these kids. Show them what's possible when you don't let circumstances define your limitations. And maybe, if we're lucky, we'll discover the next Sarah Mitchell in the process. The idea excited me more than any concert I'd played in years. This wasn't about adding another prestigious venue to my resume, it was about using my platform to lift up the next generation of artists who were facing the same barriers I'd once faced. The talent showcase took place on a Saturday afternoon in the gym of Victoria's school, transformed with donated decorations and a makeshift stage that the maintenance crew had helped construct. The contrast between this setting and the opulent Paramount Theater wasn't lost on me, but somehow this felt more important, more real. Parents, teachers, and community members filled folding chairs, their phones ready to capture their children's moments in the spotlight. The energy was electric in a way that expensive galas never managed to achieve. These weren't people attending out of social obligation, this was a community coming together to celebrate their kids. Victoria had been working for weeks to prepare the students, not just helping them polish their acts but also teaching them about confidence, about believing in their worth regardless of their circumstances. Watching her interact with the kids, I could see how completely she'd found her calling. This was her stage, her moment to shine. Even though she wouldn't be performing, Destiny was scheduled to go on third. After a young dancer and a boy who played guitar, Victoria had told me about her but hadn't prepared me for the impact of hearing her sing at 11 years old. She had the kind of voice that stopped conversations, that made people forget where they were and just listen. She performed an original song about dreams being bigger than your neighborhood, about music being a bridge to anywhere you wanted to go. Her voice was untrained but pure, carrying emotional weight that many professional singers never achieve. When she finished, the silence stretched for just a moment before the entire gym erupted in applause. I knew I was witnessing something special, the same kind of raw talent and authentic emotion that had captivated the audience at the Paramount Theater 7 years earlier. This little girl in her discount store dress and hand-me-down shoes was about to change her life, just like I had, if we could give her the right opportunities. After all the students had performed, I took the stage for my headlining set, but instead of the classical pieces I usually performed, I played the song I'd written about that transformative night at the gala, the one that had become my signature piece. I wanted these kids to understand that breakthrough moments often come disguised as disasters, that our greatest challenges can become our greatest strengths. As I played, I caught sight of Victoria in the wings, tears streaming down her face. As she watched her students experience live professional music for the first time, she'd created this moment not for recognition or personal gain, but because she understood what access to art could mean for a kid who felt trapped by circumstances. When I finished, instead of leaving the stage, I called Destiny up to join me. "This young lady has something special," I told the audience, "and I think she should know that talent like hers deserves to be nurtured, regardless of financial circumstances." What happened next surprised even me. I announced that my foundation would be providing Destiny with a full scholarship for music lessons, instrument rental, and performance opportunities. But more than that, we were launching a program at Victoria's School to identify and support artistic talent in underprivileged communities. The audience response was overwhelming, but the look on Destiny's face was everything. She stared at me with the same mixture of disbelief and hope that I must have had when I was called to the stage all those years ago. I knelt down to her level, just as I had with Maria years before. "Do you know what this means?" I asked her. She nodded solemnly. "It means I get to keep singing, even if my mama can't pay for lessons." "It means more than that," I told her. "It means someone believes in you enough to invest in your dreams. But the most important thing to remember is that the music comes from inside you. The lessons will help you get better, but the gift you have that's already yours." The weeks following the talent showcase were a whirlwind of activity. The local news picked up the story, and suddenly Victoria's school was receiving donations from across the city. But more importantly, other schools began reaching out, wanting to create similar programs for their students. Victoria and I found ourselves partners in something neither of us had planned but both of us felt called to do. We applied for grants, organized fundraisers, and developed curriculum for what we decided to call the Authentic Voices Initiative. The name reflected our shared belief that every young person deserves the chance to discover and develop their unique talents. Destiny became our first success story, but she wasn't our last. Within 6 months, we had identified 12 students across 3 schools who showed exceptional artistic promise. Some were musicians, others were visual artists, dancers, or writers, but all of them shared that spark of creativity that needed nurturing to fully ignite. The program grew beyond what either of us had imagined possible. Victoria took a leave of absence from teaching to run it full-time, while I contributed both financial support and regular performances for the students. We brought in guest artists, organized field trips to museums and concert halls, and created opportunities for the kids to showcase their work. But the most meaningful part wasn't the formal structure. we'd built it was watching these young people discover their own voices and gain confidence in sharing them with the world. Every breakthrough moment reminded me of my own journey of Victoria's transformation, of the power that comes from being seen and valued for who you really are. One evening, as Victoria and I were reviewing applications for the next round of scholarships, she looked up from her paperwork with a reflective expression. "Sarah, do you ever think about parallel universes, about how different our lives might have been if that night at the gala had gone differently?" I considered the question, thinking about all the ways our paths could have diverged. Sometimes, but then I think about destiny and all these other kids, and I realize that everything happened exactly as it needed to. Your cruelty that night led to my breakthrough, which led to your transformation, which led to our friendship, which led to this program that's changing lives. So you think we were meant to go through all that pain just to end up here? I think, I said carefully, that we were meant to learn that our worst moments don't define us unless we let them. Your behavior that night wasn't who you really were, and my fear and insecurity weren't who I really was either. We both had to be broken open to discover our authentic selves. Victoria nodded, then smiled in a way that reminded me why our friendship had become so precious to me. "You know what I love most about what we've built here? These kids will never have to feel like they don't belong in spaces where art happens. They'll grow up knowing that their voices matter, that their stories deserve to be heard. And maybe," I added, "some of them will go on to create opportunities for the next generation, just like Emma did for me, and we're doing for them." That night, I went home thinking about legacy, about the ripple effects of both kindness and cruelty, about how the most transformative moments in our lives often come disguised as our worst failures. The girl in the $12 dress had become a woman who could write checks to change lives, but more importantly, she'd learned that real success isn't measured by applause or recognition. It's measured by how many people you can lift up along the way. Today marks exactly 10 years since that life-changing night at the Paramount Theater, and I'm writing this final chapter from the most unexpected place, the same community center in Englewood, where I took my first piano lessons as a child. Victoria and I have just finished the ribbon-cutting ceremony for our newest Authentic Voices Initiative location, built in the neighborhood where my journey began. The irony isn't lost on me that I'm back where I started, but everything has changed. The little girl who once practiced on an old upright piano in a cramped room now has access to a state-of-the-art music facility, with instruments and equipment that would have been unimaginable to me at her age. More importantly, she has something I didn't have back then, a community of adults who believe in her potential and are invested in helping her achieve it. Destiny, now 14, cut the ribbon alongside us. She's grown into a confident young woman whose voice has only gotten stronger with training, but who hasn't lost the authentic emotion that first captured everyone's attention. She's been accepted to a prestigious performing arts high school with a full scholarship, but she still comes back to volunteer with the younger kids in our program. "Miss Sarah," she said to me after the ceremony, "remember when you told me that? The music comes from inside me, and the lessons would just help me get better. I finally understand what you meant." "Tell me," I said, genuinely curious about her perspective. "The lessons taught me technique and theory and how to read music properly. But the thing that makes people stop and listen, that comes from all the experiences I've had, all the feelings I've felt, all the stories I need to tell. You can't teach that part, you can only create space for it to grow." Her wisdom amazed me, but it shouldn't have surprised me. These kids understand authenticity in a way that many adults never grasp, because they haven't learned yet to hide behind masks or perform versions of themselves that they think others want to see. Victoria, who has now been running the Authentic Voices Initiative for 3 years, has become one of the most respected advocates for arts education in the city. She's testified before City Council, written op-eds for major newspapers, and been featured in education journals. But if you ask her what she's most proud of, she'll tell you about individual students, about Marcus, who discovered he's a gifted sculptor, or Aisha, who writes poetry that makes adults cry. "The best part of this work," she told a reporter last month, "is that I get to witness young people discovering their own power. Not the kind of power that comes from money or social status, but the power that comes from knowing who you are and having the confidence to share that with the world." As I look around this renovated community center, filled with kids practicing instruments, working on art projects, and discovering their voices, I'm struck by how far we've all come. The scared young woman in the thrift store dress, who once felt like she didn't belong anywhere, is now creating spaces where belonging is a given, where every young person is valued for their unique gifts. But perhaps the most beautiful part of this story is that it's not really ending, it's multiplying. Every student who goes through our program becomes a ripple in the pond, carrying forward the lessons about authenticity, resilience, and the transformative power of believing in yourself, even when others don. Emma, who started it all with her secret advocacy, now serves on our board of directors. Margaret Chen, who had the wisdom to call me to that stage 10 years ago, has become a close friend and mentor. Even some of Victoria's old social circle, the ones who laughed at my dress that night, have become donors and supporters, perhaps understanding now that true elegance has nothing to do with designer labels. The $12 dress still hangs in my closet, preserved like a sacred relic. Sometimes I take it out and remember the woman who wore it that night, how small she felt, how convinced she was that she didn't deserve to be in that room. I want to tell her that she was wrong about not belonging, that she belonged everywhere her voice could bring beauty and truth and connection. But mostly, I want to tell her that the hardest moments of her life were about to become the foundation for something more beautiful than she could have imagined, that the cruelty she experienced would teach her compassion, that the fear she felt would make her brave, and that the humiliation she endured would become the source of her greatest strength. The girl in the $12 dress became a woman who understands that we all belong in any room where we can contribute something of value. And sometimes, the most valuable thing we can contribute is simply the courage to be authentically ourselves, thrift store dress and all.